Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you tonight to an interesting person who I've come in touch with. Leanne Sawchuk is her name. She is a registered psychotherapist, an energy practitioner, and a public speaker. But she says, most importantly, she's human first, and we'll accept that and want to develop that and explore that a little bit. She specializes in addictions, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, eating disorders, grief, and trauma. She runs a diverse and inclusive private practice in Kitchener where she offers individual and couples therapy. She recently launched an online program, Freedom from Anxiety program, which I think we all probably need a little bit during COVID-19. And we're going to discuss that a little bit today. As a trauma and anxiety warrior herself, Leanne developed this comprehensive program as a means to show people that they truly can experience freedom from anxiety. So Leanne, you were a trauma and anxiety warrior yourself?
That's right. Sure. So I identify as being a trauma warrior, trauma survivor, having undergone some traumatic events myself in life. I developed quite debilitating anxiety. And a lot of people would be really surprised to hear that about me because most of the ways in which I was anxious was very internalized. And so I've always been described by people as someone that has it all put together, is relatively calm and collective and grounded. But meanwhile, for the longest time in my life, I've had a lot of internalized anxiety, meaning my insides were like I was highly, highly anxious person. And for a long time, anxiety really ruled my life. It ruled my relationships. It ruled my decision making. How I showed up in my life was very much based on my limiting beliefs. For a long time in my life, feeling like I was very misunderstood, feeling like I was not enough, and a strong, strong strive for perfectionism in pretty much everything that I did. I felt like either I had to get it perfect or not at all.
Where did this anxiety come from?
Well, a few different areas. Some of it I'm still processing myself. I have about 15 years of repressed memory, meaning I don't have access to my memory from pretty much birth until almost the age of 13. And so it's hard to process something you don't quite remember, but I've been undergoing my own therapy for that for a very long time. And beyond that, I can share more about this when I dive deeper into my personal story. But anxiety really developed for me, I think, in my teens. I lived in the States for about 4 years. My father got transferred there for a job. And then we seemingly abruptly moved back. It felt abrupt to me. And beyond that, that's when I really started noticing my anxiety surface. And then it just kind of skyrocketed from there.
And why was this abrupt move back so traumatic?
I felt so settled where I lived. I felt like I belonged. I felt like I had a lot of solid friends. I was really enjoying myself there. I mean, as much as I didn't want to move there, then I didn't want to move back, right? And I mean, it was a time in my life when I was in those prime development years where it was hard to move. And moving back, I was moving back for grade 10, meaning like here, at least the school systems, high school is considered grade 9. So people had already established their friendships and already had their groups. And I was showing up with a Southern accent that I had developed and I felt so different, right? And I really never really found my group of people. Like throughout a lot of high school, there was a couple of people I really connected with and I'm still in contact with now, but it felt like it took me a long time to fit in. And I'm not quite sure I ever did, to be honest with you. So it was going from being really, really popular, the popular person in school, to kind of being an outcast. I think I really struggled with that and struggled a lot with my identity during that time.
And did dealing with your own anxiety and your own issues sort of spur you to your current occupation?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually remember I think it was grade 11, and that's when I started really like focusing in on school more. For the first year I moved back here, I was just not interested in school. I skipped classes all the time and this and that. And I had an art teacher at the time who was like my favorite teacher, Miss D, we called her. And I remember one day she said to me, she's like, "Have you considered art therapy?" And I hadn't. I actually had never heard of it, but she knew my passion for art. It was something I loved doing. And I also really knew I wanted to be in the helping profession, even at that time. And I looked into it, and honestly, I started really pursuing the arts and got a scholarship, went off to university, and then became an art therapist. That's how my career
An
started.
art therapist.
Yeah.
What is
Yeah.
an art therapist?
So an art therapist typically deals with the emotions, but often in a nonverbal way. I find that it's a very gentle but pretty profound way of processing one's emotions. I started off by working at a place called Carrie's Place Autism Services, and I worked with a lot of adults who were completely nonverbal, and I developed an art therapy program for them. And it was a means of how they would express themselves. They would get out some paper and whatever mediums I would present to them, and they would draw or paint or color. And there's so much that gets expressed through art, through the canvas, through what's on the page. And then what we do is we utilize whatever this person has expressed and we explore that. So rather than us talking back and forth like this, we'd look at the piece that was created and it'd be like, well, tell me about what you created, right? And it's just a nice kind of like segue into someone's feelings. And if they're nonverbal, that's okay too, because they're still just really expressing, and they could use what's called picture identification symbols to kind of communicate back and forth with me. So that's where it started. And then I did some work in the psychiatric wards at Grand River Hospital. And I did art therapy there with the patients. And it was just another means of healing, of expressing themselves through art. And then I moved into my private practice. And for the first little while, I was solely focusing on one-on-one sessions in art therapy. And it was through that I was like, okay, I really need to expand on this. I want to get deeper. Not to say art therapy doesn't go deep, it definitely does. But I had a strong desire to kind of become specialized in something. And that's when I went back to school and became a registered psychotherapist.
What a fascinating story. And, it's interesting because number one, the picture above your shoulder is really quite interesting and makes one think about what the artist was thinking when drawing that. But number two, I was president of the Mississauga Arts Council. We had a famous psychotherapist from Britain come and speak. And her quote was, I won't get this exactly correct, but it was something like, when words fail us, art speaks for us.
Yes, totally agree with that. And it's such a safe place. I work with a lot of people that identify as trauma survivors. And these individuals, sometimes myself included, I can relate, have a really hard time being able to articulate into words their experience, right? To be able to say out loud, this is what happened to me, this is what I went through, but being able to paint it or draw it is different, right? It feels sometimes like a lot more of a safer avenue for people to express.
We're chatting tonight with Leanne Sawchuk. She's a registered psychotherapist, energy practitioner, and public speaker. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about trauma, about psychotherapy, about relationships. We're talking about anxiety with Leanne Sawchuk, who is a registered psychotherapist. She also is an energy practitioner, which I have no idea what that is, so we're going to ask her about that. And she's a human first, she says. What do you mean you're human first?
All right. So what I mean by that is when I show up with my clients, I show up as my whole self, and I'll explain that even further. Something that's often expressed is, or at least trained even, is that therapists should be blank canvases. They should be blank slates. So you go in and see a therapist, you really shouldn't know much about their life, about them. They're just there, right? To listen, to empathize, maybe to reflect back. And quite honestly, I get that. I understand boundaries, and I don't disclose information about myself to clients unless it's beneficial to the therapeutic relationship. But I'm a relational psychotherapist, and there is a difference between a psychotherapist and a relational psychotherapist. And a relational psychotherapist really looks at my relationship with whom I'm working with. So let's just say you're my client. I would focus on our relationship as being a huge part of our work together, meaning like how I show up with you, how vulnerable I am with you, how safe I create of a space for you, how much I'm willing to contain, even things like being on time for the session, ending the session on time. All of these things create that. And joking around, like I build a lot of rapport and trust with my clients. So much so that I have a lot of clients that come back and see me after a couple of years. They return, and typically we don't end until we're done. And so I believe that the therapeutic relationship is vital. And I believe that a part of that is me showing up as a human with flaws. I've had clients get angry with me. We work it out, but I look at it as, hey, at least they're brave enough to share that, hey, I said something and maybe offended them, or I left them feeling a certain way. And so a lot of times how we end up showing up in therapy very much represents relationships around us. And so if I have a strong fear of judgment, I might eventually bring that into my therapeutic relationship and think, okay, you know what? I don't want to say this because my therapist is going to judge me. And it's that person having the willingness to bring that up. And I don't think that people are going to be as willing to bring that up to their therapist unless they have that really trusting relationship. Similarly, I have no issue with my clients letting them know if I feel like I was wrong, or if I reflected on something I said and I come back the next week and say, you know what, I'm not sure. Like, I was sitting with that and this is how I'm feeling about that now. How do you feel about me feeling that way? And so I really feel that first and foremost, me showing up as being just another human in this relationship, as opposed to there being any sort of power imbalances, has been really, really effective in my work.
Fascinating. And so what you say is that others think that psychotherapist has got to be a blank slate. So tell me, what is the non-relationship relational psychotherapist situation like, and what's the justification for that? Not getting emotionally involved or something?
Yeah, like it's kind of like you don't necessarily want your clients to know too much about you. You've got to be really careful with that relationship. I'll give you an example, a personal example of that. I went to see a therapist. This is a whole other story, but I went to see a therapist when I was discharged from a hospital, and he was a psychoanalyst, which is slightly different than a psychotherapist. And he wouldn't let me look at him. So on top of me not knowing anything about him, when I would enter his office, he had me sit in a chair. I had to face back onto him, and he wouldn't ask me any questions. And so I saw him for 4 sessions. The first session, I felt so uncomfortable, like having someone sitting behind you and your back on. And all I remember is looking in front of me, and he had these wooden ducks like everywhere, literally. And I would get lost in these wooden ducks and all these books he had on his bookshelf. And we spent 2 sessions in silence. And then he'd be like, okay, time's up. And I ended up leaving.
Why would you bother going?
Because I heard such good things about him. I had a friend who went to see him, and she's like, oh, it was really effective. But for me, I needed to feel safe, and I needed some prompting. Not everybody can go into therapy and just be like, just spill the beans, right? And I'm one of those people where I need someone to kind of help prompt me, at least as a client, to share things with them. And he just wouldn't. And one day, my last session, I got quite angry with him. And I said, can you just ask me something, like get me started? And he said, no. And I said, okay, I'm going to leave. And so I'm not saying that's what the psychotherapists do. He was a psychoanalyst, but that's just an experience of me feeling like, wow, how will I ever share anything with this person? He won't even let me look at him, first of all, right? So it was a very uncomfortable experience.
Okay, now that sounds bizarre. And so I would have walked out too. But with the way you've described your situation, you got to get really emotionally involved with people. You must become like their close friends.
Yeah. I mean, I had a client actually earlier today that expressed a lot of gratitude, specifically gratitude about our relationship. She's like, this feels like such a safe place for me. And I agree. I mean, I form relationships.
Too emotionally involved such that you're actually a friend. You're no longer a therapist.
Well, we have rules about that within the college. And so because we're 2 humans in a relationship, I mean, it's possible that a therapist can, have feelings for their client, or their client have romantic feelings for them. It's possible to want to develop a friendship with somebody because you just feel so connected. And I mean, while they don't really encourage that, there's also rules that's set out in the guidelines around what to do should that present itself, which means, obviously you need to end the therapeutic relationship immediately. But I'm very boundaried as a human. As much as I show up human first within my work, I still do carry with me some level of boundaries so that I can be careful with that as well.
Do you like your job?
I love it.
Why?
I feel like when people say living out your passion, I feel like that's what I'm doing. I feel like I have so much passion. There's no such thing as the Monday blues for me. It's no such thing as, oh, thank God it's Friday. It's just, I genuinely enjoy getting up in the morning and looking to see who I get to see that day and sitting down with them. And I know for me as a human being, I get bored so fast. This is something I've always known about myself. I get bored in relationship and friendships. I get bored. So I need a lot of variety. And this job definitely gives me a lot of variety because I don't really know what each day is going to bring. I don't know who's going to share what and how it's going to go. So every day is different. And I really love that. I love the
If you
challenge.
get bored in friendships and bored in relationships, is it because you're trying to psychoanalyze them too?
No, I turn it off, believe me. I remember when I first became a therapist, I had a hard time turning the switch off. Like I would analyze everybody and they would know that it became a laughing matter, right? But now I have this ability to turn the switch on and off. When I sit down in what I call my therapist chair, the switch is on. And when I leave, the switch is off. And it doesn't mean that I'm that different than how I am in the therapist chair, but I have people in my life that are, we have fun together. There's a lot of stimulation in my relationships, which is good. And if I get bored, that's not because of the other person, that's on me. And I just have to figure that out. So, but I definitely don't get bored in my work. That's for sure.
You say that you specialize in, and here's the list: addictions, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, eating disorders, grief, and trauma. That's a lot. Doesn't sound like you specialize. It sounds like you're involved in everything.
Yeah, so my main area of specialization out of all of those would be eating disorders and trauma. But I've taken a lot of additional training and education and other things like anxiety and depression. And the truth is those things tend to be interwoven in trauma, right? So for example, there are a lot of people who identify as being addicts or having, unhealthy relationships with substance. And many of them have some element of anxiety and or trauma in their history. And so all of these things are sort of interwoven. It's hard to learn about trauma without learning about addictions. And so I did another 4 years of training in somatic experiencing, which is a modality.
What is somatic experiencing?
Yeah. So somatic experiencing was developed by Peter Levine. He's like a pioneer in the world of trauma. And it works with the body specifically. So something I came to learn very early on in my work is that people have a hard time always articulating themselves when they've gone through trauma. Some people have repressed memory. Some people black out. Some people don't have full access to what happened to them, right? And there's not always value in digging in someone's trauma. There's not always value in being like, okay, let's dig in there. Let's expose yourself to it. I know people might disagree with me on that. But if people don't have full access or they don't feel safe in doing so, somatic experiencing is a very useful modality. And basically what that is, and believe me, this is never easy for me to explain. It's easier for me to teach and to try it on you, but I won't do that right now, is I'm working with bodily sensations, and somatic work specifically works with the nervous system. And so when somebody is in a state of stress, they go into one of the 4 F's, which is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Okay. The typical ones we hear about in society is fight or flight, but there's also freeze or fawn. So anyone that's endured trauma, there is a good chance that they go into 1 or 2 of those as their primary. So when they're stressed, they might freeze up, or they might fight, or they might fawn, which means like appease or accommodate, or what was the other one? Or they get out of there, they avoid conflict altogether, right? Somatic work helps to deactivate that by really digging into the person's nervous system. And how I do that in session is when I'm sitting across from somebody and we're talking about something. Say you're describing to me a traumatic event or a frustrating conversation you had, 5 years ago. At that point, I would get us into your actual nervous system by saying, okay, close your eyes if you're comfortable with that. And now we're going to track sensations. So I'd have you actually access in your body wherever it is that you were having a sensation in that moment that connects to that memory. So if I'm thinking back about the snowmobiling accident that I had 6 years ago, and I close my eyes, immediately I might start to feel sensations in my stomach, maybe in my neck. And then what happens is that person, I would guide them to track those sensations until they completely deactivate and they move somewhere else. And what you're doing there is actually deactivating the body memory that corresponds to what actually happened to you. And we call it blue vortex and red vortex. It's a lot to explain, but basically we're increasing your capacity to feel safe and to allow your nervous system to complete a full cycle so you don't get stuck. You don't get stuck in fight mode, flight mode, freeze mode, or fawn. You can just feel your feelings and move through it.
And are you saying that some of these techniques can deal with addiction issues?
Absolutely. I believe that somatic work can deal with anxiety. It can deal with any sort of discomfort that's presenting. So it's one of the modalities that I call upon at times when I'm working with clients who come to see me specifically for trauma, if they're willing to do that type of work.
Now, you said you also specialize in eating disorders. Why eating disorders, and what is unique about that?
So the first area that I specialized in actually was eating disorders when I started my practice. And a big reason for that was I was diagnosed with bulimia when I was in my 20s. And I had struggled with an eating disorder for about 15 years. And it was through my own diagnoses of being hospitalized and going through the whole system with that, and then being discharged, that I started to move through my healing process. And something, quite honestly, that was told to me time and time again by psychiatrists and many other professionals in the field was that you can really never recover from an eating disorder. So I remember attending an information session at the hospital in which I was admitted to. And I remember one of the psychiatrists standing up there and saying, you know what, people with eating disorders, you'll have this for life. Like, this is something you'll always battle, you'll always struggle with. And I remember being like, geez, what's the point of treatment then, right? If I'm always going to have this, like, why lock me up? But anyways, I went through treatment anyways, didn't work. And then I ended up finding a therapist who specialized in eating disorders. And that's what really propelled me on my journey to be like, oh no, you can totally recover from an eating disorder, because I did. And so, not to say that's the only reason, but I'm like, no, you can. And telling people that they can't, I feel, is just really unfortunate, because that just means that that's always going to be a part of your identity. Do I still have some food anxiety from time to time? I mean, a little bit, but I'm otherwise like pretty much fully recovered. So that's what propelled me to create an eating disorder program and to really take people through their own recovery. And I have helped countless of people so far recover from their eating disorders, which is quite lovely.
So that's interesting. And let me draw a comparison, if I could, to addiction. AA, don't they say that you're always going to be an alcoholic? And in fact, they say all the time at AA meetings, my name is blah, 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 I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic. And they think that one of the reasons why you got to say that is it's got to be part of your identity if you're going to get over that. Does that make any sense? Or is that frankly as wrong as the psychologist that told you you're always having a disorder, eating disorder, and you can never recover from that?
Yeah, I've actually had some pretty heated debates about the question that you just asked me. I mean, I'm open to answering it very honestly. And my honest answer is I think it's really destructive. I know of people that have been sober, clean and sober for 20, 25 years, and they still attend their AA sessions or meetings rather, and that's fine. But even after 20 or 25 years of sobriety, they're still sitting down in these meetings and they're saying, my name is Leanne and I'm an alcoholic, right? And I think that a lot of the work, at least the work I do with my clients, is we really need to detach from these parts of our identity that keep us stuck. And if I were always like continuing, even though I'm recovered, if I were to continue to say, you know what, my name's Leanne and I'm a bulimic, or I have bulimia, even though I don't want to identify with those labels anymore. And I think that continuing to say that, I think it does a lot to the brain, because our thoughts in a lot of ways become our reality. And if I tell you all the time that this is what I am or what I struggle with, then, I mean, what if that isn't true? I'm kind of lying to myself, right? So
I believe manifesting and like you say, if you keep on saying it to yourself,
yeah,
become true.
Yeah, I think there'd be power in people that have been sober for 20 years, even 5 years, even a month, to sit down in these meetings and say, and I have been sober. Exactly. And so I know that AA meetings are very beneficial to some people, and I totally respect that. But some of the language that's attached to identity and saying I am, any I am statements, we've got to be careful with what we're saying about ourselves. So that's my opinion on that.
We're chatting with Leanne Sawchuk tonight. She's a registered psychotherapist, energy practitioner, and a public speaker. We're having an interesting conversation about lots of different topics. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Leanne in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Leanne Sawchuk, who is a registered psychotherapist. She's in Kitchener-Waterloo. She specializes in just about everything. She's addictions, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, eating disorders, grief, and trauma. And she runs a private practice in Kitchener where she offers both individual and couple therapy. We've been chatting a lot about a relational psychotherapist and how that's different, and about eating disorders. But maybe, Leanne, we could go back to, you said that anxiety was sort of what was the first thing that caused your issues, and that you then wanted to address either through art therapy or then in your own practice. Tell me about anxiety and how it developed in your life and what you did about it and why you wanted to practice in that area.
Sure. So anxiety really showed up for me, as I mentioned earlier, after I moved back here from the States. It was probably there before then too. It was probably even there when I was a kid, but I don't really remember that. And it developed in a way that I ended up being such a perfectionist. And it was my perfectionism that I believe contributed to my eating disorder that I experienced at that time. I felt the need that I had to do everything perfect. I needed to be in control of my body. I needed to be in control of what I ate or didn't eat. And it was obviously an issue. I mean, I got pretty sick. And then I realized that anxiety doesn't have to be as debilitating as it is or as it seems, and that there actually are ways to move through it and gain freedom from it. That does not mean that we live our lives or we can get to a point of living our lives without ever experiencing anxiety, because anxiety is a human emotion. And so just like anger or happiness, sometimes we're going to become anxious. But there's people, and I was one of these people who anxiety would completely take over my life, where I was living from one fear-based thought to the next fear-based thought to the next fear-based thought all day long. It was like this never-ending thought loop that I just couldn't get out of. And so when that happens, I mean, essentially, you're no longer in the driver's seat of your life. Anxiety is in the driver's seat of your life. And it was through my own healing work that I did. I saw a therapist for a very long time. And I did a lot of my own inner work. I changed up some of my friend groups, and I had to do a lot of unraveling and purging, if you will, that I realized, okay, it's okay to feel anxious. That's a human emotion, but it's about how we respond to the anxiety that matters the most. And so I started really working on, okay, how do you respond to your anxiety? What are your deeper fears? How do we dig into these fears? And I developed anxiety workshops. And so pre-COVID, I was running a lot of these anxiety workshops in person, which was lovely. And then when COVID happened, there was definitely an increase in anxiety collectively, I would say. And I realized, now is probably the time to launch this anxiety program online that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And so that's when I developed the Freedom from Anxiety program, which is essentially a very comprehensive 6-module program that is based on all of my years in practice up until now, plus life experiences, plus filled with tools. But mostly it's not just about managing the symptoms, it's about getting to the root. And oftentimes what happens, and I totally understand this and get it, when someone's anxious, they come into therapy, they're like, "Hey, Leanne, I'm anxious, make my anxiety go away." And I'm like, got some good news and some bad news for you, right? And so we can manage the symptoms until we're dead. I mean, I have about 50 tools I could give anybody and be like, okay, this is what you do when you're anxious, but I don't want them to do that until they're in the grave. Or we can get to the root. We can get to, all right, when did your anxiety develop? Why do you think it developed? What's its origin? We can look at, what are you afraid of? Because underlying anxiety is always fear. Always, always, always fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being judged, fear of not being loved, fear of not being enough. I could go on, but those are the main ones. And when we can dig into those fears and flush them out, like take somebody, for example, that has social anxiety, right? I try to explain to people, you weren't born with social anxiety. You didn't come out into this world being like, yep, totally socially anxious here, right? At some point in their life, that happened. Something happened.
Like that happen? How does something like bulimia happen? How does this anxiety, this perfection, like how does it happen?
So bulimia specifically is called a behavioral addiction. And so how I like to explain this is the same way that I explain alcohol addiction or any substance addiction, is it's a form of coping. So similarly, how somebody would cope with, they learn somewhere in their life, you know what, whenever I'm stressed, I'm going to take the edge off with a drink, right? And then that one drink leads to 2 drinks, leads to 3 drinks, leads to drinking all day long. And before they know it, maybe they are an alcoholic. Similarly, behavioral addictions, which for example is bulimia or any eating disorder for that matter, is the same thing. It's a form of coping with discomfort. And so how somebody with bulimia would cope with discomfort is like, okay, I'm really stressed. So I'm going to cope by not focusing on the stress, but I'm going to focus on food and what I'm going to eat. I'm going to focus on my next binge and how I'm going to get so much comfort through all of this food. And then I'm going to purge it, or I'm going to over exercise. It's still a form of coping with discomfort, right? And so we all develop ways of coping with discomfort, whether that's through gambling or through sex addiction or through gaming addiction or through substance addiction or through eating addictions. We just find our way. You know, and then there's also healthier practices like coping through yoga, right? But I didn't cope through yoga at that point.
What's that? Sounds like that would be, can you get addicted to yoga? I presume you could.
I feel like we can make an addiction out of anything. Just like I think we can make anything a habit where we can hyper fixate on anything we want to, right? Although I feel like that wouldn't be such a bad habit.
So is sex addiction a real thing?
Yeah.
And it's a coping mechanism.
Yes. Yes.
To deal with anxiety of not feeling adequate or something?
Yeah, I've worked with several people that identify as sex addicts in my practice over the past several years. And, you know, it's so interesting speaking with these individuals because some of them have histories of trauma. Some of them have histories. A lot of times there's a lack of self-worth involved, but also an element of addiction. And the interesting thing that I've learned, and I'm sure there's some people that maybe don't relate to this, but I'm only basing this off of the people I've worked with, is it isn't so much about the end result for these people. So it isn't so much about the actual act of sex with whomever they're having it with, but it's all of the chasing and everything that is involved prior to that. It's the looking online, it's the setting up the time of meeting, it's to expressing what they want to see happen and how they want to experience it. It's all of that that creates such a dopamine release, right? Hence the addiction. And it's exciting and it's a rush and it's a risk and it's a getting away with. So much so that that's the exciting part. I've had so many people share with me like, yeah, once they get to the part where they're actually meeting the person, they're kind of over it. And they're excited about the next person that they're going to reach out to, right? And it's like, yeah, because you're going after dopamine. You're good, that like kind of like cocaine, right? The dopamine rush, the actual chemical release that happens in the brain, similarly happens when you're finding someone online.
So it's the excitement of the chase.
Yeah. And also the control too, right? Like some of these, some of the things that some individuals are looking to experience in these interactions or relations are things that they might feel shame about asking their significant other or asking other people in their life for, you know, be it fetishes or whatever. So they feel like, you know, oh, I can get this sort of thing met over here in secret and nobody has to know about it, right? So there's that piece too of really playing out fantasy and escapism in some ways.
You must deal with some really interesting people.
I do. I deal with some really interesting and courageous humans. And that's, like I say, there's never a boring day in my practice, you know, and
you get bored with friends and relationships. Do you
I
get
shouldn't have said that so point blank, should I have?
do you get
Um,
addicted to funny and interesting and challenging stories?
I don't. I'm not addicted to it. I just love being challenged, right? Nice try there. I love being challenged by people. And, and honestly, most of my friendships and the ones I still have in my life, they're full of variety and, and we have a lot of depth. I think that's what I mean by bored is I don't do well in superficial relationships where we're just on the surface. So how's the weather today? Oh, it's great. Did you see what's in the news? Yep. I mean, the news is exciting, but I like deep. I like to really get to know somebody. And so a lot of the friendships I have, we have depth in our relationship, which I love.
But you're not addicted to people that need therapeutic help.
No, no,
Okay. So it's different than yeah, it's
totally.
different than the chase of a sex addict.
Yeah, totally. And how I know that is I have really solid boundaries. And so I can say no easily. When the weekend comes or whenever my days off come, I'm off now.
You're off.
And so that's how I can tell like I don't feel addicted to it because I'm not checking my emails, my vacation responders on. I'm not available during that time. And I have good boundaries in that way.
A lot of what we've talked about is anxiety. Do you deal with people with high anxiety like all the time?
A high percentage, I'd say, of my client base right now are definitely experiencing high levels of anxiety. I do believe that some of the contributing factors to that is the pandemic that we've been moving through has certainly increased some anxiety levels for people or even depressive states, but certainly anxiety. And anxiety is really interwoven in so many things like eating disorders, there's anxiety, and addictions, there's anxiety, relationship troubles, there's anxiety. And so it's such a common denominator in so many people's lives that it's almost inevitable that with most people, we're going to talk about their anxiety at some point in our treatment or in our time together. So that's why I also developed that program is because there's such a need for it. And I also wanted to provide something to people that was accessible to people all around the world. Whomever wanted to access this could access this from the comfort of their own home.
How do people sign up for this program?
On my website. So there's a link on my website on the main page that will take you right to the sign up page for the Freedom from Anxiety program.
And your website is?
www.leannesawchuk.com.
Okay, sounds good. It's interesting that you focus so much on anxiety and on trauma. And I thought most people went to therapists for relationship issues.
Yeah, definitely. So I love dealing with relationship issues. And it has become a bigger part of my work. About 20% of my practice right now, I work with couples. Pretty much everyone I see at some point, we're talking about their relationships, especially if we're talking about anxiety. Because one of the first things I ask people is I'm like, okay, who are the core people in your life, right? Who are your people? Who's in your corner? And how often do you experience anxiety in these relationships? So a lot of times when we're unraveling anxiety and I'm treating anxiety, I'm also looking at, okay, how can you put better boundaries in place in this relationship with your partner or with your friend? Or what fear is playing itself out in this particular relationship. So we end up talking about relationships anyways. But people come to therapy for all sorts of stuff, all sorts of stuff.
Do you have some basic recommendations on relationships?
Like what?
I don't know. Someone told me about the 5 love languages.
Oh yeah, I love the 5 love languages. So I think that having a conscious relationship with yourself is first and foremost how you need to show up in relationships. So I think you're going to ask me.
Conscious relationship with yourself. What the heck do you mean about that?
I knew you're going to ask. I'm ready for you. So what I mean by that is you need to, a lot of times when we go to therapy for relationship issues, we're so focused on what is the other person doing wrong? What do they need to change? So I can feel better in this relationship, right?
Blame other people all the time.
That's right. And so when I'm working with couples, I'm like, that's not going to work here. Like, that's not how we're going to practice. We need to look at, okay, yeah, it bothers you when he or she does this particular thing, but how are you showing up in the relationship? What's your stuff, right? What are you contributing? What are you not contributing? And a lot of times when we do our own inner work, we can show up differently in relationships. So yeah, I might be triggered every time, we sit down to dinner and you don't talk to me and you're on your phone, right? And yeah, the conclusion to that would be, well,
I
this is
hate that. Oh, I hate that.
I know. The conclusion to this could be, well, just get off your phone, right? But part of the work is like, okay, if I were to ask myself, well, why does that bother me? Why does it bother me that you're on your phone whenever we sit down to dinner? And it might be because, well, I feel rejected, or I feel like I'm not being witnessed, or I feel, insignificant, right? Okay, well, let's talk about that. And so there's some unraveling on both ends.
The person just doesn't care about you.
I know. It's disrespectful, yes.
Like being late all the time.
I know. I can't stand that either. That is one thing I can't stand. That's my area of work, is not being so irritated with people when they're late. But yeah, I think that the love languages is important. But here's the thing about the love languages that we sometimes get wrong is when you do the love languages quiz, and I don't know if you've ever done it before, but when you do the love languages quiz, it will tell you which love language, what your love language is, right? And let's just say yours is words of affirmation. And let's just say, whomever you're in relationship with, their love language is physical touch. What we often do in relationship is we speak our love language to the other person and we don't speak their love language. So that's how it's supposed to work in relationship. It doesn't mean that because your love language is words of affirmation that you keep providing words of affirmation to your significant other and that's going to work. It's not.
It's like speaking a different language to someone that doesn't understand it.
Exactly. And a lot of times we think, well, I love acts of service. So it's great when I pack this person's lunch every day. And it's like, yeah, but they don't care about acts of service. They just want you to tell them that you love them. Right. And so when we can apply love languages in a relationship, I actually think it's quite effective. Not the be all and end all, but definitely a beautiful tool.
So since we're talking about, we should probably quickly review what the 5 love languages are. Do you know them all?
Yeah. So, oh boy. So there is physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, and acts of service. Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
We're chatting tonight with Leanne Sawchuk, who is a registered psychotherapist in Kitchener-Waterloo. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about bulimia. We're talking about relationships. And we're talking about anxiety and a new website that she has, a program that she has started. And what's it called again?
Freedom from Anxiety program.
Freedom from Anxiety program that you can get on her website. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm having a really interesting, wonderful conversation tonight with Leanne Sawchuk, who is a registered psychotherapist. She's in private practice in Kitchener-Waterloo. You got to check her out if you're interested in her services. And if you have anxiety, you got to check out at www.leannesawchuk.com her anxiety workshop called Freedom from Anxiety program, which sounds fascinating. Leanne, supposedly addiction is up real big. We talked about anxiety a lot, but addiction is up real big because of COVID-19. And I guess one of the ways that people are coping with anxiety and isolation and stuff like that is addiction and alcohol and marijuana and whatnot. What you expressed some reservations about AA. What do you do with people that are addicted to alcohol or drugs?
Mm-hmm. So I like to look at somebody's addiction as a relationship, and I'll explain that a little bit further. So when I'm exploring, let's just take alcohol, for example. Okay. When I'm exploring somebody's dependency or addiction to alcohol, I'll say, we're going to treat alcohol like it's a person just for a moment. And I want to understand what you're getting out of this relationship with alcohol. How does it serve you? How does it not serve you? Like, what are you getting out of the relationship? And a lot of times exploring that brings up a lot for people. They're like, oh, well, I'm getting comfort, or I'm getting release, or I'm getting an escape, or whatever, right? And then I like to explore people's history with alcohol. Like, when did they first become introduced to it? When did they first realize that it could be a tool, right? Then I like to look at patterning. So for example, when are you drinking? What was happening moments before you took that drink? What were you feeling? Was it boredom? Was it sadness? Was it anger? Was it anxiety? And then what we do, rather than looking at like, okay, well, can you just drink less, right? Because wouldn't that be easy? We look at what are your triggers? What are the emotions or feelings or thoughts that you are trying to soothe through anxiety, through alcohol? And how can we just work with those? Like, let's talk about them. Let's flush them out. Let's hash them out. And then it is putting in a replacement, like, okay, how can you replace alcohol with something different? But that replacement of how can you replace alcohol with something different comes a little bit later in our process together. Because if somebody first comes into me and be like, well, I drink at this time, I'd be like, well, can you walk your dog? Right? They'd be like, well, if I could just walk the dog, I wouldn't be here right now, right? So we have to really look at, how is this serving you? What is it you're coping with? How can we flush out your shame? Let's flush out your guilt. Let's look at what is your pain that you're trying to soothe? And that's where I go, which is pretty much going to the root.
That's so fascinating. I was invited to go to a musical theater program, and I think it was called Breaking Up with Ed. And it was breaking up with eating disorder.
Yeah.
And it was exactly the way you describe it. It was this person had identified eating disorder as Ed, as a relationship, and how she needed to break up with Ed because Ed was no longer serving her needs. It was I'd never thought about that as thinking about your disorder as a relationship.
Yeah. And I do the same thing with anxiety. In fact, a lesson in one of my modules in the anxiety program is actually breaking up with your anxiety. It's creating like a writing. I take people through this writing piece where you're actually thanking it, saying goodbye to it, and ending your relationship, at least the relationship you've had with it up until this point. Similarly with Ed, I look at his eating disorder as an extension of yourself. I call it the eating disorder voice, right? And learning, how can you talk back to that voice rather than it coming and taking over you? How do you talk to it and be like, no, not today. No, I'm in
It's
control.
fascinating. You've had bulimia, you've had your eating disorder, you've had anxiety. You wanted to be a perfectionist. No, you were a perfectionist. You didn't want to be it. Do you think your ability to be a very good psychotherapist to a certain extent is based on the fact that you've gone through your own challenges, and that if you hadn't gone through your own challenges, you wouldn't have the empathy or understanding for other people that you do?
I do believe that. I believe that. I'm not saying that every therapist out there needs to have gone through a lot of hardships in order to be good at what they do. I do believe empathy is something you can learn, and and all of that. But I think that being able to sit down in a chair across from my clients and relate to them, because I've gone through it and understand, it just provides a whole other level of connectedness, a humanness in our relationship that I don't think is easy to find other places. I've worked with therapists whom I have felt have really understood me versus ones that have read a lot of books, right? And there is definitely a difference in our connection. They call people like the wounded healers, right? And I think in a lot of ways, that's what I am, as a wounded healer. So, yeah.
Leanne Sawchuk, registered psychotherapist. We never found out what energy healer is. We'll have to talk about that on our next show. Thanks so much for joining us. Check her out, Leanne Sawchuk in Kitchener, if you need any of her services, and or go to her website if you want to deal with anxiety and check out her anxiety program. That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.